There's something almost incomprehensible about what happened in those final months of 1945, something that defies simple explanation. Picture, if you will, the shattered landscape of Japan after the war ended, after the instruments of surrender had been signed and the fighting had ceased. What remained were skeletal structures where homes had stood, narrow passages between ruins where merchants had once called out their wares, where children in traditional dress had run and played. The nation sprawled before the world as a monument to devastation. Buildings stood roofless against grey skies. Rubble littered every thoroughfare where commerce had once thrived, where rice had changed hands and business had flourished. Among these broken stones wandered survivors whose faces told stories of deprivation, their eyes searching desperately for anything edible, any scrap that might quiet the gnawing emptiness in their bellies. Picture a woman, her cheeks hollow from starvation, holding her baby close to her chest. She hummed old melodies, traditional songs meant to comfort, trying desperately to soothe the infant's cries that came from hunger rather than any ailment a lullaby could cure. The air itself carried memories of destruction. Smoke had penetrated everything, becoming part of the very fabric of what remained. Every wall, every piece of clothing, every surface held that acrid reminder of what the bombings had done. Now layer onto this image of desolation something unexpected, something that seemed to come from another world entirely. The sound of metal striking metal, the hiss and pop of oil heating in large pans, fragrances wafting through air that had known only the smell of ash and despair. American military kitchens had arrived in the devastated cities. Yokohama, Osaka, Fukuoka, places that had been reduced to fragments of their former selves, now saw these mobile cooking stations rolling through their streets. Soldiers wearing olive uniforms, men who days earlier had been combatants carrying weapons designed to kill, now stood over portable cooking equipment. They worked carefully, turning pieces of chicken in hot fat, preparing food with the same attention they had once given to their military duties. The chicken fried in those pans represented something entirely foreign to Japanese tastes and experience. Its aroma, heavy and rich, almost overwhelming in its intensity, spread outward from the cooking stations. It drifted past barriers of barbed wire, floated down alleyways where children hid in shadows, reached into spaces where families huddled together in their ruined homes. This contradiction formed the heart of an almost unbearable paradox. The identical individuals who had operated the aircraft that released incendiary bombs, who had participated in the destruction of entire neighborhoods, these same people now extended warmth and sustenance to those who had survived. Nobody missed the irony of the situation. For the Japanese civilians, the experience carried an almost ghostly quality. How could the same hands that had guided instruments of annihilation now offer gestures of compassion? The soldiers themselves found the transformation disorienting. Some admitted in letters sent home that preparing meals for civilians felt more surreal than actual combat had. Yet the facts were undeniable. America's military apparatus had pivoted from delivering explosives to distributing nourishment. One corporal serving in the occupation forces documented his thoughts in a personal diary entry dated September 3rd. He wrote that he never imagined a day would come when their most effective tool would be cooking equipment rather than armaments. He observed that the local population no longer regarded them with hatred. Instead, he detected something different in their gazes, something he tentatively identified as hope. His words captured a bizarre historical moment that somehow escaped the broader historical narrative. In that particular moment, an unusual quiet settled over these scenes. The only sounds came from oil bubbling in pans and the cautious footsteps of civilians who inched closer despite their fear. Men and women who had lost everything to warfare found themselves caught between terror and temptation. What did it signify to accept nourishment from those who had been instruments of death mere days before? The psychological shock of this reversal marks the true beginning of this account. The calendar showed 1945, and Japan faced starvation on a scale difficult to comprehend. The official surrender ceremony aboard the Missouri had taken place on September 2nd, bringing formal hostilities to a close. But the cessation of fighting did nothing to address the suffering of millions. In Tokyo and Nagoya, once vast urban centers, now transformed into wastelands of ash and debris, civilians picked through wreckage searching for anything edible. They looked for burned rice grains, for anything at all that might be consumed. Government assessments from that period estimated that nearly 80% of Japan's cities had been obliterated by aerial bombardment campaigns. The rice harvest had failed catastrophically. Maritime shipping routes had been severed. Famine loomed as an existential threat to a population of 72 million people. The prevailing expectation held that defeated Japan would face punishment, humiliation, and abandonment. The nation would be left to struggle beneath the crushing weight of its own militaristic choices. For years, government propaganda had characterized Americans as demonic entities who would show zero mercy. Mothers whispered warnings to their children that falling into enemy hands meant certain death. Some families had even contemplated suicide rather than face capture by American forces. This psychological landscape, shaped by years of wartime messaging, formed the backdrop when American supply trucks first rumbled through devastated streets. But these vehicles carried not ammunition or additional instruments of war. They carried flour, preserved foods, and poultry. In what remained of Osaka, a widow who gave her name as Haruko later described her expectations of how Americans would treat her. She anticipated contempt and mockery. Instead, she witnessed them unloading sacks filled with cornmeal and other provisions. She wrote in correspondence that survived the decades that followed, expressing her belief that the occupiers would laugh at Japanese hunger. But they cooked instead. When the smell reached her position, she experienced complete confusion about whether she should flee or collapse in gratitude. Her testimony echoes the disbelief that millions experienced during those days. What made these scenes even more remarkable was their setting and context. Field kitchens had been engineered to feed American troops during mobile operations, not to provide for defeated civilian populations. Yet the military improvised, converting these units into relief distribution points. The logistical challenges were enormous. By October, American forces were supplying rations to more than 4 million Japanese civilians. Each portion had been calculated precisely in terms of caloric content. Fried chicken was not the most efficient choice from a purely practical standpoint. Yet it carried symbolic weight. It represented abundance from a nation whose agricultural output exceeded anything Japan could produce even in peacetime. The visual impact was unforgettable. Civilians formed lines, uncertain whether proper etiquette demanded bowing, weeping, or simply standing in stunned silence. Children peered out from behind their mothers' traditional garments, their eyes enormous in their emaciated faces, their bellies visibly shrunken from prolonged malnutrition. The soldiers serving them, some barely older than the children they fed, wielded ladles and tongs instead of rifles. Many of these same individuals had fought against Japanese forces just weeks earlier on islands whose names had become synonymous with brutal combat. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, places where American and Japanese soldiers had killed each other with terrible efficiency. Now their uniforms carried not the smell of gunpowder, but the scent of cooking oil. This formed the foundation for a quiet revolution in human relations. Rather than vengeance, there was nourishment. Rather than silence and abandonment, there was the crackle of cooking stoves. The war had concluded in flames and atomic fire, but the peace was beginning with the aroma of fried chicken drifting through ruined neighborhoods. The weight of defeat pressed down on every street corner in cities like Hiroshima and Yokohama. Survivors assembled before American cooking stations with heads lowered, bracing themselves for insults or simple indifference. Years of conditioning had prepared them to anticipate cruelty. They expected to be humiliated. Some carried that expectation in their very posture, in the way they held their bodies. Women clutched children protectively. Men kept their gaze fixed on the ground. Nobody wanted to be the first to step forward. Hunger gnawed at their physical bodies with relentless intensity. But pride and profound dread held them back from approaching. At the periphery of one such gathering, a boy, perhaps 7 years old, stared at the soldiers with eyes that seemed too large for his thin face. He had not tasted meat in months, his ribs pressed visibly against his shirt fabric, yet he remained frozen in place, as though crossing that small distance might somehow condemn him to unbearable shame. A sergeant among the American soldiers noticed the boy's predicament. With a gesture that was simultaneously casual and profoundly significant, he bent down and selected a piece of fried chicken from the cooking pan. He held it up so the child could see it clearly. He did not wave it tauntingly, as someone might tempt a beggar. He simply extended his hand, one human being to another. The boy hesitated, looking toward his mother for guidance. She shook her head slightly, torn between fear of disgrace and the maternal instinct to save her child from starvation. But hunger proved stronger than hesitation. The boy's hand trembled as he took a step forward. His bare feet scraped against dusty ground. He reached out. When the hot food touched his palm, he instinctively bowed. This was not the mechanical bow that had been drilled into schoolchildren by wartime officials. This was something that came from deeper within, a bow born of sudden relief, of gratitude so overwhelming it felt like a kind of weakness. Behind the boy, other civilians began to move. Slowly at first, the wall of fearful silence started to crack. People shuffled closer, still cautious, still uncertain, but their eyes fixed on the steaming trays of food. The soldiers worked with efficiency, distributing portions one by one. They did not act as conquerors. They behaved as men trying to address suffering they could see all too plainly before them. That particular day, diaries kept by American servicemen recorded not triumph or revenge, but something much simpler. They documented a shared meal. Lieutenant James McAllister wrote to his wife back home describing how the civilians lined up like ghosts. He had expected hatred, but when food was distributed, they lowered their heads. He did not interpret it as fear exactly. He struggled to explain what he witnessed, admitting he lacked words for something he had never experienced before. His testimony captures a moment when the sharp edge of warfare began to soften, if only temporarily, under the combined weight of hunger and shared humanity. The bowing civilians, the trembling hands, the hesitant steps toward the smell of frying oil, these formed the opening gestures of a fragile peace. It played out not in formal treaties or political speeches, but in the simple act of offering food to the starving. The reversal occurred in what seemed like an instant. Where moments before there had been only fearful silence, suddenly there was movement. A delicate exchange began to unfold amid the ruins. American soldiers, some barely out of their teenage years, gestured carefully to the civilians who lingered at the edges of the open area. The sound of oil crackling in large pans carried across open space, mingling with the powerful aroma of fried chicken. For Japanese people who had endured years of severe rationing, where millet husks and tree bark had been ground into inadequate meals, the scent was overwhelming. It seemed almost unreal, like something from a dream or distant memory. A soldier serving with the 98th Infantry Division bent down, smiling nervously as he held out a portion wrapped in paper. A small girl approached, her feet bare against the ground, her hands shaking with both fear and anticipation. The exchange occurred without words, yet it carried tremendous emotional electricity. She reached forward, and the food passed from one world into another entirely. In that instant, hunger collided directly with history. The young girl lifted the food close to her face and inhaled. Her eyes widened with disbelief. The food was warm, it was savoury, it was abundant. These were qualities she had nearly forgotten could exist. Behind her, others began to surge forward cautiously. Mothers extended their hands. Fathers held back initially, but eventually stepped into line. Their pride dissolved under the overwhelming weight of necessity. Soldiers served quickly, distributing chicken with the same efficiency they had once used to load ammunition. Yet each gesture carried something profoundly different. It represented a breaking down of the wall that warfare had constructed between peoples. The moment carried the raw force of contradiction. Here stood the conquerors wearing crisp uniforms and polished boots, but their rifles hung quietly over shoulders, not aimed or threatening. Instead of commands barked in English, there was the gentle sound of ladles clinking, the hiss of grease. Instead of jeers or mockery, there were soft nods of encouragement. Civilians had expected the cruelty that occupation typically brought. Instead, they received food seasoned with salt, oil, and unexpected mercy. One Japanese teacher later documented her experience in a notebook that was confiscated but eventually preserved by her daughter. She wrote about the moment when a soldier gave her food. She thought of her brother who had died in Burma. He must have hated these men, she reasoned, but she felt tears burning in her eyes. For the first time since the war had begun, she was not afraid. She was simply hungry, and someone had fed her. Her confession, buried in silence for decades, revealed how a simple act could dismantle years of propaganda in a single afternoon. The eyes of the children communicated what words could not. Hollow and dim just hours before, they now glowed faintly with something older than warfare itself. Life asserting its right to continue. That glow rippled outward through the crowd. Soon even the sternest fathers, men who had once sworn never to bow to Americans, lowered their heads as they accepted the food. Not in defeat, but in recognition. The paradox sharpened. The same uniforms that once symbolized terror now symbolized survival. The battlefield had been replaced by the kitchen. The weapons of war had been set aside for ladles and frying pans. The square filled with a sound unlike any heard in Japan for years. It was not the drone of bombers overhead, not the scream of air raid sirens, not the rumble of buildings collapsing. It was the mingling of two profoundly human sounds, chewing and crying. Civilians clutched food as though it might vanish if they loosened their grip. They tore into the fried chicken with hands too weakened to hold chopsticks steadily. Grease dripped down chins. Crumbs fell into ragged sleeves. Nobody cared about propriety or manners. For the first time in months, bellies felt full. The sensation itself was overwhelming, almost unbearable. Some wept openly, unable to contain the flood of emotion. A middle-aged man who had buried both his parents during the famine suddenly broke into sobs as he ate. Beside him, a teenage boy, barely skin and bone, gnawed every shred of meat from the bone until absolutely nothing remained. Then he licked his fingers as though trying to make the meal last longer, to extend the experience. Women covered their mouths as tears slid down their cheeks. Not from shame, but from the release of despair that had been building for years. The soldiers, hardened by years of combat experience, looked on in silence. Many had fought on Okinawa. They had witnessed Japanese soldiers fight to the death rather than surrender. Now they watched civilians collapse to their knees, not out of forced obedience, but out of sheer relief at having food in their stomachs. A sergeant scribbled in his personal journal that he had thought victory meant winning battles. But that night he saw it meant something entirely different. Seeing a child laugh with his mouth full, that was victory too. Amid the sobs and chewing, gossip began to ripple through the crowd. Neighbours whispered to each other about the taste, so rich, so salty, so soft. A young woman murmured to her friend that she had never tasted anything like it, not even before the war when Japan had known prosperity. An old man remembering cafes in Tokyo before the war muttered that the Americans must have endless supplies to cook like this. The word spread quickly through the gathering. Yoshoku, Western food. It had arrived not as luxury for the wealthy, but as salvation for the starving. The contrast was searing in its intensity. A month earlier, many of these same people had hidden in basements and shelters, clutching their children tightly while American aircraft dropped incendiary bombs overhead. Now those same Americans handed them steaming food wrapped in paper. It created an emotional whiplash that nobody could fully process in the moment. yet hunger forced acceptance, and acceptance began to soften fear. For one night at least, the sound of chewing and crying became the soundtrack of peace, however fragile and temporary it might prove to be. The shock came not only from the food itself, but from the complete reversal of expectation. For years, Japanese civilians had been told that Americans would spit on them, enslave them, or simply allow them to die. When surrender came, many braced themselves for scorn and cruelty. Women prepared themselves to endure humiliation. Men rehearsed ways to bow so low that shame might at least appease their conquerors and protect their families from worse treatment. Yet when the field kitchens opened and began distributing food, those fears dissolved into confusion. Instead of scorn, there came sustenance. Instead of punishment, there came portions of chicken hot enough to sting fingertips. One elderly shopkeeper in Yokohama later described the moment with disbelief that never faded even decades later. He had prepared himself to be struck, perhaps beaten, but the soldier looked at him and smiled as he handed over food. The shopkeeper had not seen such a smile in years. His memory, recorded in a family notebook, still carried the tremor of that day. To receive food was shocking enough. To receive it with warmth and kindness was almost unbearable. Many broke down not from hunger alone, but from the collapse of every story they had been told about the enemy. The Americans, too, felt the strangeness of the situation. Private William Ortiz, a cook from Puerto Rico attached to the 27th Division, wrote home that he had never expected to become a messenger of mercy in the ruins of Japan. He admitted that he still carried bitterness from comrades lost in Okinawa. Yet as he handed a piece of chicken to a little girl, he wrote that he could not hate her. She looked like his niece back home. War felt smaller in that moment. His letter, tucked away for decades, was a confession of disarmed hatred. This psychological shift mattered enormously. Propaganda that had been sharpened for years collapsed in the span of a single meal. Civilians who expected chains instead received nourishment. Soldiers who expected resentment instead witnessed gratitude. In the ruins, both sides glimpsed a truth that war had hidden. Enemies could be human after all. The scene became a living symbol more powerful than any official pronouncement. The smell of fried chicken floating above rubble spoke louder than any radio broadcast or government decree. The clatter of pans and the clink of tin plates reached deeper into human consciousness than speeches about surrender and occupation. In a single act, the occupation began not with cruelty, but with contradiction, one that forced civilians and soldiers alike to reconsider everything they thought they knew. Decades later, survivors of those days still spoke not of the bomb blasts, but of the taste of that first unexpected meal. The memory of explosions faded into distant thunder, but the memory of fried chicken endured like a flame sheltered from the wind. Children who had once lined up barefoot became elders who told their grandchildren that they knew they would live again when they tasted that food. It was not exaggeration or sentimentality. In 1946 alone, American field kitchens and supply depots distributed millions of rations across Japan. Often these went to civilians who would not have survived the winter otherwise. The numbers were staggering when examined closely. More than 3.5 million tons of food imports poured into Japan between 1945 and 1948 under American supervision. Yet among all those statistics and impressive figures, it was the small human exchanges that endured in memory. One former Japanese soldier, repatriated from China after the war, recalled returning to his ruined hometown and finding his younger sister clutching a bone with scraps of American chicken still on it. He confessed years later that he had fought for years with a rifle in his hands. But what saved his family was a kitchen operated by the enemy. His voice, preserved in post-war interviews, reflected the haunting inversion that survival came not through glory in battle, but through nourishment from the enemy's hand. Even for the Americans, the memory lasted. Veterans admitted that when they spoke of occupation duty, they did not first recall the stern orders of General MacArthur or the formal ceremonies of surrender. They remembered children laughing with their mouths full, They remembered women weeping over warm food. One corporal, interviewed in the 1970s, said simply that he gave a woman a piece of chicken and he believed she gave him back his humanity. This is the message that echoes across time. A bomb can destroy in an instant, but a shared meal lingers for generations. Destruction is remembered in ruins that eventually get rebuilt. But survival is remembered in taste, in sensation, in the warmth of food pressed into trembling hands. What haunts is not only the fire of war, but the oil crackling in a pan, the first aroma of fried chicken drifting through the silence of defeat. The paradox completes itself in this way. The same empire that unleashed fire on Japan also fed its children with the taste of America's kitchens. Bombs ended the war. Fried chicken began the peace. History often remembers its firestorms more clearly than its silences and small kindnesses. We are taught the numbers. 2 atomic bombs dropped. Entire cities erased from the map. Millions displaced and homeless. Famine spreading like shadow over the land. Yet memory is not always carved by explosions and dramatic events. Sometimes it is shaped by the quiet, almost ordinary moments that follow catastrophe. In the ruins of Japan, where ash still clung to walls and hunger made people into ghosts of themselves, the act of sharing a meal became more powerful than the roar of engines overhead. Survivors did not carry with them only the trauma of destruction. They also carried the taste of life's return, the warmth of fried chicken pressed into their palms, the smell of oil replacing the smell of burning buildings, the sound of chewing replacing the wail of sirens. It formed a paradox so sharp it cut into the soul. Yesterday's enemy became today's provider. A weapon of war was replaced by a kitchen stove. Generals signed formal treaties. Politicians delivered speeches about democracy and reconstruction. Economies were gradually rebuilt from nothing. But beneath those layers of official history lies a more fragile truth. Survival was felt most immediately at the level of the stomach, of the human body sustained and kept alive. One meal could undo years of propaganda. One act of unexpected mercy could plant the seed for decades of alliance between former enemies. A simple piece of fried chicken, in its own quiet way, became a symbol of rebirth and possibility. Perhaps that is why this memory has endured longer than many political declarations and diplomatic agreements. Bombs brought death and destruction, but food brought the promise of continued life. Fire scorched the cities and left them in ruins, but kitchens soothed the wounds and gave people hope. When elders remembered what kept them alive during those desperate months, they did not describe the noise of bombers or the flash of explosions. They described the warmth of food pressed into their hands by men they had been taught to hate. They remembered the taste of salt and oil and chicken. They remembered the moment when hunger was satisfied and fear began to fade. They remembered when the paradox of war and peace became real in their mouths and bellies, and survival tasted of something they had never expected to receive from yesterday's enemy.